As you can see, I continue to move from place to place whilst on my trip to Germany, and I'm afraid this again is affecting the quality of the picture and perhaps the sound on these videos. Bear with me, there's nothing much more I can do over and above what I have already done, and it's either compromise on picture quality and sound or give up on videos completely. And I'm reluctant to do this, given that there still seems to be interest in following what I have to say, and that's why I continue. So without further ado, let's press forward with our video today, which, like all my recent ones, will be shorter than the usual videos I do when in London. Now, we are at a critical point in the West in 3 elections. Today, Sunday, 30th June, we are in the first round of the French elections, parliamentary elections, called unexpectedly by President Macron of France, directly after his party did disastrously in the European Parliament elections, which resulted in a runaway victory by Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National. Now, there's much speculation as to what exactly it was that President Macron was expecting to achieve by calling these elections at such an early time. Most assume, as I do, that he was hoping that perhaps in the event that he were to call parliamentary elections, there would be a rally behind him and his party in the elections, basically to stop the Rassemblement National in its tracks. Well, if that was the plan, it has not succeeded, or at least not according to the current opinion polls. The very last opinion poll that I have seen puts the Rassemblement National polling at around 38% of the vote. The next party or group of parties, a coalition of left-wing parties called the Front Populaire, is polling at around 30%, and Macron's party is trailing far behind at less than 20% of the vote. Now, these, of course, are opinion polls. We will know better by the end of today, when the results come through, what the outcome will be. But if the results are as they currently appear to be, then it will become clear that President Macron has lost control of the French National Assembly, the French Parliament, in which case his ability to govern France will be significantly compromised. The French Constitution places the president in overall charge of foreign and defense policy. He still will exercise sweeping powers in that respect. And of course, he will retain the power to call elections, parliamentary elections, whenever he chooses. But the French National Assembly, the parliament, controls the budget. The prime minister is an extremely significant figure. And it's very difficult to imagine that a leader, parliamentary leader, in this case, the leader of the in Parliament of the Rassemblement National, would be able to get on with such an overweening and difficult and arrogant personality as Emmanuel Macron. I've speculated in the past that if the election goes very badly for his party, as it looks as if it may, then President Macron himself might resign. There have been articles to this effect in the French and British media, and by the way, they have been growing in number over the last few days. Of course, if that happens, we will presumably get presidential elections in France this summer, and in that event, Marine Le Pen looks in pole position to become President of France. So that will be a radical change in French politics. It would be a radical change in the politics in Europe. We don't know exactly what Marine Le Pen will do. We don't know what her relationship is going to be with her parliamentary party, which is in theory led by someone else. So lots of uncertainties, but certainly she has spoken critically of President Macron's foreign policy. She still seems to want to hanker after a better relationship with Russia. She has opposed military deployments in Ukraine, and one senses that the shift, the mood amongst the French public is increasingly against support for the strong policies that France and Europe have followed against Russia, in summary, against Project Ukraine. Now, the other important election that is underway is the election in Britain. And here we have a very different situation, but in some ways, a situation which is not completely unlike the one in France. Now, the latest opinion polls all show what, on the face of it, looks like a blowout victory for the opposition Labour Party, led by Keir Starmer. And of course, the Labour Party in Britain is a party which follows very closely the current orthodoxies of what one might call the neoliberal establishment. It fervently supports Project Ukraine. It hankers after a closer relationship with the EU. Most of the leaders of the Labour Party almost certainly want to take Britain back into the EU. My own view is if the Labour Party consolidates itself, succeeds in consolidating itself as the future government of Britain, in other words, if it is not racked by crises over the next couple of months and years, then probably after the election after this one, if it wins again, it will make clear moves to take Britain back into the EU. And of course, in every other respect, over Project Ukraine, over every conceivable issue of importance, it closely tracks the foreign policy positions of the current administration. It does so, for example, over the situation in the Middle East. It's notable how in Britain, the Labour Party, for example, spoke out against a ceasefire in Gaza at a time when the Biden administration in the United States appeared to do so. And then when the Biden administration began to shift ground and became more supportive of the idea of a ceasefire in Gaza, the Labour Party in Britain tracked that change in stance and has also begun to speak about the need for a ceasefire in Gaza. Having said that, if one looks below the figures, it seems as if the Labour Party is polling significantly less well than it has done in earlier elections. For example, every opinion poll that I've seen this morning, shortly before, a few days before the election takes place on the 4th of July, shows the Labour Party polling at around 38 to 41%. This is below the 42% of the vote that the Labour Party achieved in 2017 when it was led by Jeremy Corbyn. Moreover, opinion polls in Britain, I think it is fair to say, generally, though not always, are favourable to the Labour Party. They overstate the level of its support and understate the support of the opposition right-wing parties. So it might be, and again the operative word is might, it might be that the Labour Party is going to do even less well than that. Moreover, there are reasons to think that the turnout in this election is going to be low. So we might end up in a situation, it is not impossible, where the Labour Party not only polls in percentage terms less well than Jeremy Corbyn did in 2017, but polls substantially less well than he did, both in 2017 rather, and conceivably even in 2019. Well, we will see. But anyway, there does not seem to be, and this is perhaps the key point to take away, a very, very strong tidal wave of support either for Keir Starmer or for the Labour Party. I'm going to make a further personal observation as somebody who has followed many, many general elections in Britain, whose first general election, of which I have a clear memory, was the one in 1970, which takes you all the way back to the time when it was Harold Wilson leading the old Labour Party against Edward Heath leading the old-style Conservative Party. Well, I've never known an election fought as poorly as this one, by the candidates, the leaders of both of the main parties. And in my opinion, the Labour campaign has been poor and unconvincing. And frankly, if it had been up against a strong opponent, then I think Labour would have been in serious trouble in this election. The only reason why they look set to win a landslide, despite this underwhelming support for them, as shown by the opinion polls, is because the governing Conservative Party is clearly in deep crisis. Its leader, Rishi Sunak, is obviously disrespected by most of the party and has come out as a most unconvincing Prime Minister and leader of the party. And of course, his general policies have been unpopular. Neither Labour nor Conservative nor the Liberal Party, which used to be the third party in British politics, has done especially well, because none of them address the key core issues that worry people in Britain most, and those core issues, to a great extent, at least in my opinion, centre on around the topic of Project Ukraine. The only party that has convincingly argued against this issue, other than the small Workers' Party, left-wing party, which has only recently emerged and which has not so far made a big impact in the opinion polls. The only party that has been pressing these issues is Reform UK, currently led by Nigel Farage. Exactly how well it is doing in the opinion polls is, however, difficult to say, because there is a very wide range in the polling data related to this particular party. We will have to wait and see, but it does seem as if it is positioned as the third most popular party in Britain, which, if true, and even if because of the eccentricities of the electoral system, still fails to provide it with seats in the House of Commons. But if it does emerge in percentage terms as the third biggest party in Britain, that will mark an important shift in British politics. Anyway, the third election is in some ways the most interesting of all, and that is the one which is currently underway in the United States. As I have said already, following the president's disastrous performance in the television debate that he had with his opponent, the Democratic Party appears to be in meltdown. So far, it looks as if the president and his immediate circle, including his wife and family, are digging in and are insisting that he will continue to stand and will insist on being his party's candidate, the Democratic Party's candidate in the election in November. But my sense is that the pressure on the president is increasing. Apparently allegedly the donors are unhappy. And I read a report yesterday, which of course I cannot confirm, that the president has been told that he has 1 week in order to get a grip and to persuade everybody that he is a convincing candidate, and unless he does that, then confidence in him will begin to collapse. None of this resolves the question of what happens if the president does indeed step down. I would reiterate again that if the president does step down, it's not clear to me who would take his place. It seems, so far as I can see, that in terms of the Democratic Party's own rules and the constitutional arrangements, if the president steps down from his candidacy, the person who would go forward to lead the party into the November election would be the Vice President Kamala Harris. And I know that that is a thought that is unwelcome to most people. But as I have said already, it is very late in the day to start shifting candidates. And, well, there's been much commentary, including by former President Obama, contrasting the false, lying statements that the president's challenger supposedly made over the course of the debate. Most of the alleged lies, in my opinion, are better described as differences in opinion. I don't necessarily see them as lies. But anyway, I think this is a dangerous topic to bring up because, of course, if the president is persuaded to step down, well, his opponent then has a response to this whole issue of dishonesty. He can point to the dishonesty that has been around for many months, years even, by the Democrats, much of the media, the political class, the government, the officials of the government, the doctors, all of those people, in insisting that the president was well and fully in control and fully in charge, and when it would appear that that was not the case. Now, that brings me to my final point on these issues, which is to repeat again the point made by Seymour Hersh, veteran journalist that he is. I think he alone, as far as I can tell, and I accept that on my travels, it's not possible for me to read as widely and as extensively as I do when I am in London. Anyway, Hersh is the only journalist I know who asks the obvious and proper question: if the president is not able to campaign, how is he able to govern? And if he cannot govern, who is in fact actually in charge of the government of the United States? Now, that is, to me, far and away the most important question to ask at this time. Not the question of who is going to defeat the president's opponent in the election in November. We are in the middle of two terrible wars, one in Ukraine, one in the Middle East. The United States is intimately involved in each of these wars. The situation in Ukraine is in danger of spiraling out of control. There's talk of allowing American weapons to be used to conduct deep strikes into Russian territory. The Russians have responded strongly and have warned of countermeasures. The Defense Secretary of the United States, Lloyd Austin, was concerned enough to telephone his Russian opposite number to find out what all that was about. The Russians are now talking about bringing down American drones over the Black Sea. They are restarting production of intermediate range nuclear weapons. And in the Middle East, we have good reason to think that the situation there is deteriorating as well, with talk that Israel might be about to start some kind of prolonged military confrontation with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with Iran, which is also, by the way, in the process of an election, giving clear warnings that if there is a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, then this time Iran cannot simply afford to stand aside. And we have those two conflicts. We have a potential conflict in the Far East. American admirals have talked wildly of creating a hellscape situation in the seas around Taiwan. There is a conflict between China and the Philippines, with the Philippines asking the United States for support, and the situation there looks dangerous as well. And over and atop and beyond this, there are the constant rumblings of a potential fiscal crisis emerging, whose epicenter could be the United States, where public debt is increasing at a rate of $1 trillion every 3 months. There is currently a major crisis in the financial markets in Brazil. The currency is depreciating, the stock market is falling in Brazil because of nervousness about the spending plans of the Lula administration. There are concerns about the fiscal position in Italy and France, in the Eurozone, with problems perhaps growing in the Eurozone as well. There's constant uncertainties about the situation in Britain. There's recently been riots in Kenya, which appear to be connected to debt issues and fiscal problems in that country as well. And many people are starting to see, there's a good article about this by Jeremy Warner in the Daily Telegraph today. Many people are starting to see all of these signs as indicators that the main fiscal crisis, the one in the United States, is looming just over the horizon. Now, that might be right or it might be wrong, but if it is right, or even if it is wrong, one still needs a president fully in charge, fully engaged, at the wheel, able to pilot the United States through these problems. Anyway, there we are, 3 very important elections. Of course, if the president is persuaded to stand down in the United States over the next week or so, then we are going to get an immediate election of some kind in the United States. That election will happen within the Democratic Party, as the various factions within that party fight each other to determine who will be the party's candidate in the presidential election in November. And the focus will fall on the Democratic Party and its potential divisions. And that, of course, will be, if you wish, a kind of dress rehearsal for the main election, which will take place in November. So altogether, a period of great political uncertainty in the 3 countries, the United States, Britain, and France, all of which are nuclear powers, all of which are permanent members of the Security Council. The 3 of them together might be said to make up the core of the collective West, and in every one of them there is uncertainty. Now, this uncertainty is taking place, as I said, at one and the same time when there are 3 wars underway. And of course, by far the biggest of these 3 wars is the one in Ukraine. And I've been reading comments now and complaints that suddenly, after a period of several weeks of relative silence about the situation on the battlefronts, we've had an explosion of information, most of it coming from Ukraine, all of it showing that the situation on the battlefronts for Ukraine has deteriorated drastically during the period when we were getting less information than before. Now, I will say, I have noticed over the last couple of weeks that we were getting fewer pieces of information than previously. I hadn't appreciated the extent of which this is because of a general silence in information provided by Ukraine, but it now seems that that period is ended, and the suspicion is that Ukraine had come under instructions to appear to stabilize the situation on the battlefronts in the critical period before the presidential debate, and that once the presidential debate ended, the Ukrainians have had to release information on the trot telling us that the situation, in fact, had never stabilized at all, and that it was, in fact, on the contrary, deteriorating and deteriorating drastically. Now, I've seen several claims to that effect. The most striking has come from Dima at the Military Summary channel. It could be that he is the person who has first thought this up, and it is not implausible. It is a perfectly possible explanation for what has happened. But I am going to express my own view. I have always felt, I've always been following the war closely. I've been reading not just Ukrainian, but also Russian commentaries about the state of the fighting. I've never seen myself this loss of momentum on the part of the Russians, this prolonged pause that many people thought existed. It has always seemed to me that people, rather than following, rather than tracking very carefully what the Russians were saying, which has consistently proved more reliable than what the Ukrainians were saying, rather than follow that, were somehow persuaded that there was a pause, even though it's been my consistent impression that Russian accounts of the situation on the battlefronts are more reliable than Ukrainian ones. People persist in giving the Ukrainians more credence than, I'm sorry to say, I think they deserve. Anyway, let's first of all begin with a quick roundup of let's continue now with a brief roundup of what is actually taking place on the battlefronts. Firstly, I spoke yesterday about the situation in Volchansk, how there's now film of a movement of an armored column of tanks and armored vehicles of the Russian army through one of the main streets in Volchansk. This seems to confirm that Russian armor has now finally been committed to the battles in Kharkiv region, and it also shows the Russians in positions which you might expect them to occupy if the high-rise area, as the Russians themselves say, has been brought under their control, and where they would probably be if most or all of the aggregate plant was also under their control in Volchansk. Now, there are pictures of Ukrainian troops north of the Volga River in this general area, but my overall impression of their presence is that these are attempts by the Ukrainians to try to cross the Volga River in relatively small numbers. They rapidly get cut off by the Russians, and the survival period for these lightly armed Ukrainian troops that are sent across the Volga River is short. The Ukrainians have recently made claims that they've regained ground in the area immediately north of the Volga River. I suspect that these claims have been spread around simply in order to take away attention from the catastrophic situation the Ukrainians find themselves in the aggregate plant and in the area of the high-rise buildings, where the Russians, even if they have not gained complete control, are clearly now strongly in the ascendant. And, well, let's read what Group of Forces North tell us about the situation in Volchansk over the previous 24 hours. They wrote this late yesterday, and they say this: in the Volchansk direction, fierce fighting continues in Volchansk. This is the first sentence that they always write about the fighting, the situation in Volchansk. And they say our assault groups, step by step, advance in the southern direction to the Volga River. So they admit that they have not yet fully cleared all the territory in the area north of the Volga River, this loop of the Volga River, this forested area, but the Russians claim that they are continuing their advance in this direction. Note that they don't refer anymore to the area of the aggregate plant or to the high-rise buildings, but we've seen the Ukrainian film of the Russian tanks in an area where you would expect to find them if both the aggregate plant and the high-rise buildings was either fully or partially under Russian control. And it looks, as I said, as if the Russians are, if not fully in control, at least partially in control of both of those locations. And then Group of Forces North goes on to say this: the enemy continues attempts to concentrate reserves in the area south of the Volga River. As a result of fire damage to river forcing sites, this is to places where the Ukrainians tried to cross the river to enter Volchansk from the south and to try to hold the Russians back from reaching the Volga River. Anyway, as a result of fire damage, in other words, artillery strikes, that the Russians have conducted against the crossing points along the Volga River, Group of Forces North says up to 25 enemy soldiers were destroyed. The total advance on the Volchansk direction was up to 100 meters. So this clearly, the advances that we're now hearing about are by the main Russian forces clearing the area just north of the Volga River in the area south of the aggregate plant and of the high-rise buildings. And Group of Forces North then tells us that in the Lipsy area, we repelled one enemy counterattack of up to 15 men, destroying up to 7 enemy soldiers, and advanced towards Lipsy. So the Russians claim that they're now again advancing in the Lipsy area. And Group of Forces North goes on to say Russian aviation destroyed another Ukrainian deployment point near Lipsy, where there were up to 40 enemy soldiers. The total advance in Lipsy amounted to 150 meters. So the Russians have now resumed the advance towards Lipsy. And over the past 24 hours, enemy losses amounted to up to 300 men. And then, as they always do, Group of Forces North concludes with these rather interesting general comments. The redeployment of large forces to the Kharkiv direction is not particularly helpful to the Ukrainians in offensive actions. Cases of refusal to take part in senseless assaults in such formations as the 92nd Brigade of the Ukrainian army are increasingly frequent. So Ukrainian soldiers are refusing orders to attack. We would like to make a special mention of our air defense units, which repelled another attack using American missiles, that's to say, ATACMS missiles on the Belgorod region. Victory will be ours. So, instead of a Ukrainian offensive taking place in the Kharkiv area on the eve of the NATO summit meeting, which starts on the 9th of July, a summit meeting which President Biden is due to attend, just saying, instead of, as I said, the Ukrainians conducting an offensive, the Ukrainians mounted certain sporadic attacks on Russian positions in Volchansk and in Lipsy. They have suffered very, very heavy losses. The Russians have now started to deploy armored units in Volchansk. Specifically, they continue to advance in Volchansk, and they've now resumed the attacks in Lipsy. Kharkiv remains a sideshow, but for the record, it is the Russians, not the Ukrainians, who are advancing in Kharkiv. Claims that the situation around Kharkiv has been stabilized are wrong. What happened is that the Ukrainians managed for a time to slow the Russian offensive in Kharkiv region at the price of terrible losses, but the ability of the Ukrainians to hold the Russians back looks like it is becoming exhausted. Ukrainian troops are becoming disaffected and exhausted, and the Russians look like they have resumed the advance. That, it seems to me, is the true story of what is happening in Kharkiv region. Now, let's move quickly to what's going on in other fronts. Firstly, more reports today that in the Chasov Yar area, the Russians have now finally and completely cleared Kalinina, this village to the northwest of Chasov Yar, which, by the way, just for the record, appears to be named after the Soviet politician Mikhail Kalinin, one of Joseph Stalin's major lieutenants. Just saying, this is a region, the Donbass, as I said, with a very, very strong commitment to the Soviet Union, to the Bolshevik movement, and it continues to be reflected. That fact continues to be reflected in many of the place names. And it's clear that the Russians are well established now west of the aqueduct in the Chasov Yar area on the northern flanks of Chasov Yar. We also now have further confirmation that the Russians have captured another building on the western part of the micro district, which lies to the east of the aqueduct in Chasov Yar. And this micro district is referred to as the Citadel. I spoke yesterday about the one solitary Ukrainian vehicle that drove along the road of death and which managed to reach the high-rise buildings at the very western edge of the micro district, how it was being shelled right all the way until it finally reached the buildings in the micro district. How this film, to my mind, conclusively proved that this road is to all intents unusable for the ferrying of large supplies of men and machines to the micro district, and how it's clear to me, at least, that the resistance in the micro district is crumbling, and, well, we've had further confirmation of this. Further north, there are more reports of Russian advances in the Siversk area. As I discussed yesterday, the Russians have captured the important village of Rozdolovka there. There's some reports that they've advanced further up the railways east of Rozdolovka towards the village and important railway station of Vimka. And as I said yesterday, it's clear that the Russians are in the process of closing the ring around Siversk, the battle for which surely is likely to start probably before the end of the summer. Just say, if we go further south, there's been further reports this morning of more advances by the Russians deeper into Toretsk, this major town, an urban conurbation located west of the Russian controlled city of Gorlovka. And it looks as if the Ukrainians, despite the major fortifications that they've created in Toretsk, are unable to hold back the Russians. The Russians seem to be breaking ever deeper into Toretsk, and I think that Redovka's claim that the Ukrainians have stripped the garrison of too many troops to hold all their positions in Toretsk, well, it's clear that this is true. And there are now reports that the Russians are starting outflanking maneuvers by sending troops from more territory that they've now occupied to cut off roads towards which supply the remaining Ukrainian garrison in Toretsk, and that they are now resuming the advance towards the village of Alexandropil, which lies immediately to the west of the H20 highway, where the Russians, of course, are now strongly located. East of the highway, in villages like Arkhangelskoye, north of Avdiivka and Ocheretino, and where, of course, they are also located west of the highway, directly south of Alexandropil, in another village called Novobakhmutovka. So the Russians appear now to be conducting a major campaign to capture Toretsk, to break Ukrainian defenses in Toretsk. Now, just to again highlight the extent to which this was formerly a deeply Bolshevik-oriented area, I understand that the former name for Toretsk, the name that it had during the period of the Soviet Union, the name by which the Russians still refer to this town, the town of Toretsk, they still call it Dzerzhinsk. And that, of course, is a name which commemorates Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Cheka, one of Lenin's most closest associates, the Cheka, of course, being the organization that ultimately spawned the Soviet secret police. He is a famous figure in Soviet and Russian history, revolutionary history, and there we see that the Russians still refer to Toretsk by his name, and that apparently is still the preferred name for Toretsk of many of the local people. Anyway, fighting intensifying there, and if we go further west, it's now generally acknowledged, in fact, by all parties, that the Russians have completely captured Sokol, another village to the west of Ocheretino, and that they've captured most of the village of Yevgenivka that lies immediately to the west of Sokol. This area has been a cemetery of Ukrainian armored vehicles, mostly American apparently, Bradleys and Abrams and other such machines. It looks like it's also the final cemetery of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the brigade that was created in the autumn and winter 2022-2023 as the brigade that would lead the breakthrough in Zaporozhye region, advancing towards Tokmak in Ukraine's celebrated and ultimately disastrous 2023 summer offensive. The 47th Mechanized Brigade, at that time equipped with Bradleys and Leopard 2 tanks, was smashed over the course of that offensive. Its Leopard 2s were then replaced by Abrams tanks. It seems that the brigade has now lost more than half of the Abrams tanks with which it was originally supplied, so it's probably now short of tanks. I've given up trying to count the number of Bradleys it has also lost. And of course, trying to estimate or guess the manpower losses that this brigade has suffered in the more than a year in which it has been in almost continuous action is very difficult to compute, but suffice to say that it is completely devastating. So, Sokol, Yevgenivka has fallen, Novoselivka, Persha, another village, likely to fall as well. As soon as that happens, the Russians, now stationed in Arkhangelskoye and Novo-Alexandrovka, will begin their advances towards the villages of Kalinovka, north of Arkhangelskoye, and Vozhvizhenka, to the north of Novo-Alexandrovka. If they capture Novo-Alexandrovka, the main highway from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka will be cut. The Ukrainian forces in Toretsk could find themselves cut off from supplies. And as I've said previously, a major cauldron will begin to emerge in which I suspect tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops could find themselves, if not exactly surrounded, then taken by the Russians in a semicircle and facing potential disaster. And lastly, summing up what's happening further south, it looks as if there's been more reports today of still more Ukrainian or former Ukrainian positions in Krasnogorovka falling under Russian control. I agree with the view that's been expressed that there's very little fighting actually now taking place in Krasnogorovka itself. The Ukrainians are steadily retreating from their remaining positions in this town. What is happening is that the Russians are gradually moving in to occupy the positions that the Ukrainians have abandoned. They're clearing booby traps. They're looking out for snipers who the Ukrainians leave behind as they retreat. And what we're seeing is a steady, methodical occupation of this town, which, of course, will end effectively the siege of Donetsk city. Krasnogorovka was a key part of the encirclement, the wave of fortified towns, Marinka, Pesky, Avdeevka, Krasnogorovka, which the Ukrainians had occupied and from which they used to shell Donetsk city. So the siege of Donetsk city will have been effectively broken, but perhaps equally important strategically is that the fall of Krasnogorovka will open the way for a Russian advance towards Kurakhovo, creating a massive crisis for the Ukrainians in the south of Donbass, in Vuhledar and elsewhere. And there we're getting more reports. But now we have visual confirmation that the Russians are indeed in control of some buildings in the village of Konstantinovka, west of Novomikhailivka, and that they're also fighting in the village of Maximilianovka, immediately to the west of Kurakhovo, just as the net is closing around Siversk in the north. The Russian net is gradually closing around the two remaining Ukrainian-controlled cities, Kurakovo and Vuhledar in southern Donbass. And all of this is happening on the eve of the NATO summit meeting on the 9th of July, which, as I said, President Biden is due to attend. We're going to have an extraordinary NATO meeting. We're going to have a new NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte. Well, he at least represents a certain degree of continuity. His views and ideas are very similar to those of his predecessor, Jens Stoltenberg. But in every other respect, all three of the major Western powers, the three Western nuclear powers, find themselves in a state of political chaos. This is true of the United States. As I said, President Biden presumably is going to have to attend this meeting, even if he decides that he's not going to stand as a candidate in the election in November. I doubt that will mean, by the way, that he will cease to be president immediately, though I suspect that if he does decide to stand down as a candidate for the election, pressure on him to stand down as president will also begin to grow, especially if the Democrats make the grudging decision that the only candidate they can realistically put up against Donald Trump is Kamala Harris, in which case they will have to have her, they will want to have her as president, at least for a few months, in order perhaps to demonstrate to the American people that she can actually do the job. So anyway, we will see. A confusing, uncertain situation with who will be representing the United States at the forthcoming NATO summit meeting. Britain will be represented almost certainly by Keir Starmer, a new Prime Minister who's never held government office, a cabinet office before. He was previously Director of Public Prosecutions, but he has never been a minister in any government and has only relatively recently even become an MP. And in France, uncertainty perhaps even greater, with President Macron looking like he's losing control and his position thrown into even greater doubt, even as the war in Ukraine appears to be at a pivotal point. There has never been more doubt and uncertainty about the political position and future of the West. Well, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Don't forget that you can you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop, where you can find all sorts of amazing things: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and our Football 24 series. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.